All right, welcome everyone. This is our first lecture for dual U.S. and Virginia history. This lecture is on the Old and New Worlds. We're looking at the clash of civilizations that occurred when Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492 and quote unquote discovered the New World. The style for these is I'm going to go through the PowerPoint presentation. It's pretty informal. I'm going to try to point out the main ideas, try to keep each slide to about 30 seconds so I can keep this short for everyone, and just get the main points so we can talk about it in class the next day. Here is what led to this moment. What led to Columbus crossing the Atlantic and end up discovering the Americas? How did all this come about? What were the motives? What were they trying to accomplish? So Columbus was given a commission by the monarchs in Spain to try to find a trade route to India by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. They wanted to exploit trade between India and China. Those areas were rich with spice and other things. So the Spanish crown decided to send Columbus, and he ended up landing in what is now the West Indies in the Caribbean, and thought it was India, hence the name West Indies, and hence the name for Native Americans, Indians. So the key to understanding here is that these people were motivated by the economic system known as capitalism. They were basically trying to earn money. So these people crossing the Atlantic were seeking a fortune after Columbus decided he was originally going across to try to create a trade route with India. But once they found out it was a new land, many people followed. So these are some of the entities that will be associated with this colonization of the New World. Conquistadors, joint stock companies, artisans and merchants, cavaliers, and indentured servants. We'll get into a little bit more of that lately, but just know that all of these entities, all these people were motivated by the desire to make money out of the New World. So when Columbus set sail, he was expected to make money for Spain from silk and spices. So what we're looking at here is gruel and burlap. This is what would have existed in Europe at the time. Burlap was a popular fabric used for clothing, and then gruel was a common thing that people ate, basically just a porridge. But these spices could help make it more flavorful. They also had salt to salt their meats, but they had silk in the Asian countries of China and India, and people like to make clothing out of silk, fine fabric. So the demand was there in Europe, and so Columbus was expected to go across the sea to bring back a trading route for that. So never underestimate the power of the human stomach. During the Middle Ages in Europe, a pound of ginger was worth the price of a sheep. A pound of mace would buy 3 sheep or a half cow. Pepper, always the greatest prize, was counted out peppercorn by peppercorn. A sack of pepper was worth a man's life. Salt was used in different areas as a form of currency, replacing gold coins or metal money. So the real initiative for Columbus was to bring back spice and other things back to Europe to be used and sold to be consumed. However, as I've mentioned several times, and as we should all know, Columbus did not find his way to China. You can see here that he left from Spain, sailed across the Atlantic, and ended up in the West Indies in the Caribbean. He turned around believing he had found India, but as time went on, they realized that they had found a new, quote unquote, new world. And so they figured out there became a system to try to explore this new world. So following Columbus's expedition, Spain began to send more missions to this new world, to the Americas, and they sent what were known as conquistadors or conquerors. These were Spanish soldiers and explorers who conquered South and Central America. They basically took everything of value and enslaved the natives. We'll talk a little bit more about the different empires they conquered, but you can see them there riding horses with their spears and their metal armor. This made a huge impression on the natives that they showed up. So we'll learn a little bit more about that, but I want you to remember conquistadors. So the incentive had been to find silk and spices to bring back to Europe, but what Columbus and what the conquistadors after him found ended up being way more valuable and became huge commodities in Europe. The Americas and the New World ended up being literally a land of plenty. People moving to Canada or settling in Canada discovered a rich fur trade. In Virginia and Georgia, people began planting cash crops such as tobacco and later cotton. New England became a source of lumber and massive fishing. The middle colonies in the Caribbean became huge trading ports, later huge trading ports for the slave trade. And then the New World attracted these following groups, attracted Cavaliers, which were planters, landowners. You've probably heard of the Virginia Cavaliers. That's where they get their nickname from. They attracted artisans who came to the New World to kind of make a new life and try to create new crafts. And then they also attracted indentured servants. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But indentured servant is basically someone would get a free boat ride, a free trip across the Atlantic to come to the New World, but they would have to work for 10 years to pay off the cost of that. But the promise of the New World went beyond just money for some groups. What was happening in Europe at the time was known as the Hundred Years' War. It was a clash of religions after the Reformation, which is stuff you should have learned about last year. But basically, there were several different religions who wanted to escape to allow themselves religious freedom in the New World. These groups included Puritans, Catholics, Quakers, Huguenots, Jews, and Presbyterians. The New World kind of promised them a fresh start, an area to practice their religion freely. There was also the motivation of nationalism. Nationalism, pride in one's country, belief that one's country could be better. And that's what the monarchs in England, Spain, and France competed for power. They were often at war in Europe, in the continent. And so when the opportunity to exploit new lands, to conquer new lands, it's a source of pride. Who has the most land, who's got the biggest colony, who has the most money. So often it's based on something like that so they could brag about it to their friends. But the problem with the New World is that it was not new. Um, People had crossed what was known as the land bridge in the Bering Strait. This is our best guess of what happened across from Russia to Alaska and started settling the Americas about 25,000 years ago, but the civilizations were about 10,000 years ago. There was 50 million plus people lived in the Americas, from Native Americans in what's now the United States, through really civilized, sophisticated empires in Mexico, Central America, and South America. What you're looking at right here is Tenochtitlan. That is the capital of the Aztec Empire, and that is what's in modern day Mexico City. So they settled, the Spanish actually conquered this city, but you can see tall pyramids. It was been rumored that Cortez, Hernando Cortez, who conquered, the conquistador who conquered Tenochtitlan, claimed it was larger than Rome. So this is just an image of an Iroquois village. The Iroquois were a Native American tribe that lived in what is modern day New York. You can see the organization, the roads, the structures, the farming. So when the Europeans showed up, they were not finding just empty land. They were finding people with forms of civilization that they quickly overthrew. So what happens when you get the desire of the Europeans to use the New World for money, for land, and you get people who already lived there? It's obviously not going to go well. It's a guaranteed conflict. But what happened is the Europeans' desire to conquer that was matched by their ability. They had fleets of ships, they had firearms and gunpowder, and they also had disease. In Europe, people tended to live closer to the livestock, so they had different diseases that people in the Americas had not been exposed to. And they had no respect for the New World. So what would happen is going to be a tragedy on certain levels. The Europeans who arrived didn't see the natives as human. They saw them as uncivilized savages. They often used the idea of bringing Christianity. These natives often worshiped multiple gods, were polytheistic. They had different rituals. Like the Aztecs in Mexico actually had human sacrifice. So when the Europeans came, they saw these people as uncivilized, subhuman. So that allowed them to do horrible things to them and not feel like they were committing a crime against humanity, committing a crime against other people. So to illustrate this point, here's a quote from a Spanish conquistador in 1546. In prudence, talent, virtue, and humanity, they are as inferior to the Spaniards as children to adults or women to men. They are like monkeys to men. So you can see the idea there that they're not even human, that they could be treated like animals, the level of respect that the Europeans have for these people. So what does this mean? The combination basically means it sucks to be an Indian. The Europeans had more firepower, had better armor, had diseases, had a lack of respect for them, didn't think of them as human, so they've had no problem with enslaving them and slaughtering them. was a horrible outcome for the Indians, for the native people of the Americas. It led to violent conflict. Often the Spanish used their superiority, is what you're seeing in this picture here. You can see Indians shooting arrows at ships while the Spanish and the Europeans are shooting back with cannons, with gunpowder. So this led to a loss of territory. The territory that had been part of these great empires of the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas in Central and South America was quickly overtaken, and then also led to a depopulation because of the conflicts of the war, but mainly because of disease. All right, so this map you're looking at here is a map of the empires that existed in Central and South America. The red is the Aztec Empire in modern day Mexico. The green is the Maya Empire in modern day Central America. And the orange there is the Inca Empire in South America. But what happened is these empires were quickly overthrown by the Spanish conquistadors, and the Portugal and Spain agreed on the Treaty of Tordesillas, which split these areas up between those two European countries. Basically, everything south of the modern day United States was split up between those. Most of the territory was Spain, as Spain had discovered them. Spain was the first to send the conquistadors, but Portugal was given the area what's known as modern day Brazil. That's why they speak Portuguese in Brazil today and speak Spanish in most of Central and South America. But what this led to was the mestizo culture, which you'll see today. So these territories of in Central and South America that Spain and Portugal controlled were tightly controlled by the crown. They decided how many colonists were allowed to go settle, and this would happen throughout the Americas as England began to settle areas in the United States, the modern day United States. And kind of a motto for this was God, gold, and glory. It's a good way of thinking about it because they were God, they were traveling for religious freedom. Gold, they were looking for wealth. In particular, they were looking for silver and gold. And for glory, they were looking for nationalism, for more territory, to stake their claim in a new land. So I wanted to go back to this idea of the conquistadors. They were the conquerors who followed Columbus to the New World, basically Spanish soldiers who came here looking for gold and try to make a name for themselves to conquer territory. It's named conquistadors. So here are some important conquistadors to make note of. Francisco Pizarro captured the Inca Empire in South America. Hernan Cortez captured the Aztec Empire in Mexico. And we'll talk more about both of these in class. Francisco Coronado, Hernando de Soto, and Juan de Ponce de Leon were all Spanish conquistadors who explored different areas of North America. But you can see here, what you're seeing in this picture here is the cruelty of the conquistadors to the native people. They're burning them, and that conquistador is about to slam a baby against a wall. You can see just the mass murder and overthrow of these people, and that's how these conquistadors overthrow these empires, with the aid of, again, their armor, their firearms, and their ruthlessness combined with their disease. They easily overthrew all these native people. So what the combination of all this did was basically destruction of the people that lived in Americas before the Europeans showed up. 90% of the natives died within a short time, within about 100 years, which might seem like a long time, but it really isn't to have that many people die out of 50 million. So one of the biggest killer was smallpox, which is a disease that the Europeans brought, and it quickly spread amongst the native populations who had no immunity to it, killing massive amounts. The Spanish also implemented what was known as the encomenda system. The encomenda system was basically, it allowed the government to commend or to give Indians to certain colonists, in return that they would try to Christianize them. Basically, it was a form of slavery. Conquistadors would go in and conquer people. You would settle some land, and the crown would give you a certain set of slaves that you said you would try to Christianize, but basically they were your slaves. So as I mentioned, part of the encomenda system was the idea of Christianizing the native people who they saw as savages, and they sent a lot of missionaries. The Catholic Church in Europe sent missions throughout the Americas to try to Christianize the natives. The city of St. Augustine in Florida was formed in 1565 by missionaries who were in that area trying to Christianized. You can see here some monks and some native people, and it looks like he is spreading some holy water on them. So this is a big part of the initiative, the God part of it, trying to spread their religion to the New World. So the remaining 10% of the natives in Central and South America who were not killed off by disease and by European conquerors tended to intermingle and intermix with the Spaniards and the Portuguese, creating what is known as the mestizo culture. So that is what you see in modern day Central and South America is descendants of these people who intermix. And what you're seeing there, that is Pope Francis, who was born Jorge Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, descendants of both Portuguese and Native Americans in that area. But it wasn't just happening in Central and South America. Other countries such as France and England were dominant, and the French actually settled in Canada. What they discovered there was a healthy fur trade. And so they set up post in the beaver trade. They were basically sending beaver pelts back to Europe, became a very lucrative trade. But Canada tends not to be as friendly an environment, colder, so fewer colonists set up there. And overall, they had friendlier interactions with the Indians. They didn't go to war with them, but they still spread disease like smallpox to them, annihilating large amounts. And so most of modern day the United States was settled by the English. You can see here the picture of the 13 original colonies going down the East Coast. These settlements started in the early 1500s, and they kind of flourished up into, we'll learn a lot more about that throughout the class, but it was a massive migration of people. These people came for different reasons. As we move on, we'll see a lot more, but they were often part of the elimination of the Indians, either through open war, but again, mainly through the spread of disease, mainly smallpox. So why a lot of people were also coming to the New World was that there was massive overpopulation problems in Europe. Trade was flourishing. The agricultural techniques were growing. Europe was coming out of an area known as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and following the Renaissance and the Reformation, the population in Europe doubled between 1520 and 1680. Many of the cities in Europe, including cities like London and Paris, surged from about 50,000 people to 400,000 people. So people a lot of times were being pushed out or couldn't survive in these cities, so they were looking for ways to make money, make a new life, and the promise of the new world drew them. So here's a quote on London in the late 1500s. London was dirty and dangerous. The narrow streets were piled with garbage and filth, which could be dropped freely from any overhanging window. Even the main avenues were dark and airless. It was a violent city which quickly crushed the unprotected innocents. For women, the age of consent was 12. Crimes were common, and in some parts of the city, people could not sleep for the cries of murder rising from the streets. So basically what you have in the late 1500s, early 1600s, London's a large city now. There's no modern plumbing. There is no modern police force. There's just people living in filth. People are throwing their chamber pots, which are basically their toilets, just out their windows into the streets, throwing their trash in the streets. People are living on top of each other. There's very little government, very little control. So there's obviously an incentive to leave those areas, especially for people fleeing religious prosecution or persecution, things like that. But it wasn't only the conditions in the cities that were bad for a lot of people in Europe. There was a decline of feudalism. So feudalism was a system where peasants were often tied to land serfs, where they worked the land for a manor owner or a landowner in exchange for land, food, etc. And capitalism was rising. Capitalism had certain advantages. That's why the population grew in a lot of ways. Trade and food was more readily available. But it also meant that by 1600, almost 70% of the people were just landless laborers. They didn't own any land. They basically worked for basically no money at all, just barely above the poverty line. 50% lived below the poverty line. So in 1600, the poverty line was basically almost death. So there was incentive to try to leave Europe. So while the population was growing in Europe, there were still many, many problems, as we've kind of talked about. There was massive starvation and poor health. The threat of famine was always there. Crops could fail because of a cold winter. Cities could die because of that. Poor health standards, as I talked about, people used to just throw their waste into the streets. That's obviously not good for health. So 50% of children during this time died by the age of 10. Often parents didn't name their kids until they were a couple years old because there was no reason the children would often die. And as I pointed out earlier, and one of the things is people were trying to escape religious prosecution. The Hundred Years' War was raging after the Reformation. So, in different sects of Christians having different interpretations of the Bible, different interpretations of Christianity, fought each other. And what you're seeing here is you see a guy holding a cross and another guy persecuting somebody, basically stabbing somebody. So there's conflicts between Catholics, Anglicans, and Puritans. So often the idea of a new world and the idea of religious freedom drew people away from Europe. So again, as the conditions in Europe were bad for a lot of people, a lot of the wealthy people saw an opportunity in the New World to exploit the resources of the Americas, and that led to the creation of what are known as joint stock companies. Basically, it's a company, it's a forerunner of the modern corporation. It enabled a group of investors or adventurers to kind of pool their capital together, invest in a company, and what happened is they would create these joint stock companies and send over people to the New World to set up a colony in the name of this company, and they would exploit that work and the resources of that area for profit. So this led to mass migration of people who were just seeking economic opportunities in the New World, and we'll talk about this more in detail. But or they were trying to escape religious or political freedom, and multiples of people were shipped to the Americas against their will. A lot of times we talked briefly about indentured servants. They were given the payment to go across America. Basically, someone paid their way because it was expensive, and they had to work for 5 to 10 years to pay off that debt. But also soon after this, the transatlantic slave trade began. Africans from the African continent were enslaved and shipped to the Americas to work as labor. The long-term consequences of this unregulated colonization was that it did bring a lot of diversity to these colonies. African slaves were coming. There were Native Americans who lived there, and there were people from all over Europe were immigrating to the Americas. But it also bred discontent. People weren't happy with slavery, happy being indentured servants, and obviously Native Americans weren't happy with having their land taken and being murdered. But it also created a sense of liberty and freedom. It was the opportunity for these Europeans to come over and create an entirely new life. Where they couldn't own land in Europe, they could come here and possibly own land, make a new life for themselves, make their money, make their wealth, practice the religion they wanted to practice. But it also instituted those ideas of slavery. The transatlantic slave trade began. You can see here in a tobacco plantation. This is a depiction of Virginia of slaves working the tobacco fields. What that will lead to is eventually lead to the Civil War down the road here. But hopefully that gives you just a brief idea of the clash of the old and new worlds. We're going to talk a lot more about this in class, kind of explain some things. Make sure you take some notes, or hopefully you took some notes for this, and be ready for our quiz next class. All right, thank you.